Probably food is, is one. Probably maybe the most important one, but it's certainly certain lifestyle issues, exercise, and things like this. I think are probably of the major importance, at least the ones that we can control. And those are fairly broad areas. Very difficult to control these in the environment in which we live, in a westernized society, where we are challenged every day by the kinds of foods and exposures we have. But if we're aware of these things, at least we have some level of control. We can control, if we are aware of our hazards in the environment, you do your best to try to avoid them. But I think what we have the least control over is our genetics. I mean, we can't do anything about that. We inherit genes from our parents, and if you know that you are at risk for a particular disease, and you know that there are environmental factors that can reduce your risk, despite the fact that you may have a genetic predisposition, at least you have some level of control. Not to say it's a perfect control, but at least it's some level of control. I mean, even if we were to know about it, there's not much we can do about our genetics. But if everyone were to assume that they had some genetic risk factor for, say, type 2 diabetes, whether or not they do or not, just challenging yourself to try to avoid those things that would put you at risk. Most of the chronic diseases that afflict people are controllable. Some people, you say, wow, some of these people can smoke all day long. They eat the worst kinds of foods. They don't exercise, and yet they're disease-free for the most part. Those people inherit genes that protect them against all this. There's very few of those kinds of people around. But the ones you find, oh, wow, if that guy can do it, so can I. Wrong. You may not be able to do that. That guy just happens to have all the genes that protect him. The rest of us probably don't have that whole constellation of genes. Because there's guys that you live, oh, this guy's 95. There was a guy the other day, he's 102 years old, jumping out of an airplane, right? I mean, he has a very powerful genetic constitution. Most people don't live to be 102, much less jumping out of airplanes. He's very fortunate to have a genetic constitution that's protected him against all kinds of environmental risks for his entire life. The rest of us, most of us, don't have that. So I don't think we can't really do too much about our genetic constitution, but we can do a significant amount about environmental risk factors. I think we have control over that. So if one were to assume that, hey, listen, I have a predisposition to Alzheimer's, diabetes, and cancer. Any one of those are going to kill me. What am I going to do in my life to try to reduce my risk? And those are personal choices. And unfortunately, most people roll the dice and say, hopefully it's not going to be me. I don't have to make those difficult choices. These are some of the things. These are more philosophical things than actually, than actual situations. The most common neurodegenerative disease is Alzheimer's disease. And that is largely an environmental problem, a gene environmental problem to be exact. There are very few people, maybe less than 5%, that actually inherit a particular mutation that's going to make or give them a high risk to have Alzheimer's disease. Then there are other inherited factors that put you at risk only if you are in a provocative environment, an inflammatory state of health, together with ApoE4 mutation, would increase your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. But a majority of people who get Alzheimer's disease don't appear to have any genetic risk factors. So, and then they're always trying to find others. But so this tells us that that disease itself is largely due to environmental factors. And what are these environmental factors that would put you at risk for Alzheimer's disease? Actually, it's, again, neuroinflammation. It's very interesting that Alzheimer's disease is kind of a hypometabolic disease. Blood sugars are reduced. The neurons in the brain seem to be starved of glucose. And as a result of this, they seem to die, leading then to the pathology that people recognize. So that's an interesting concept, and there's ways to get around that, to feed neurons through ketosis that could protect the neurons from degeneration. And people might want to consider that in their lifestyle. Most people who develop Alzheimer's, they're not sane one day and uncognitive the next. It's a slow progress over decades of exposures. The ultimate result is, a cognitive decline and dementia. There's many different forms of dementia. They're not all Alzheimer's disease. So there's prefrontal dementias, and there's a variety of other of these kinds of diseases. These are neurodegenerative diseases that could be delayed through proper diets and lifestyles. I think this is. Now, there are other neurodegenerative diseases like CTE, the football players, so boxers and football players and these kinds of athletes. So if you want to avoid that, don't play those games. It's just this kind of a thing, right? With the transporters that allow the fuels to get into the brain. So the brain uses glucose primarily on a daily basis. Our brain sucks in more glucose than any other organ system in the body. 20 or 22% of the entire metabolism of our body is devoted to the function of the brain. The brain can also use another fuel, ketones, because if we stop eating and blood sugar goes down, we don't fall down and become unconscious. We start transitioning to an alternative fuel gradually. As glucose is less and less, the body will burn fats to produce ketones. These ketones come through a different transporter system. They're not dependent on the glucose transporter. They're dependent on a monocarboxylic acid transporter that brings in ketones. And they serve as an alternative fuel for glucose. And they are much more powerful in their ability to generate energy. And also, they generate fewer free radical damage. They give a much higher efficiency of energy. Whereas in, say, Alzheimer's disease, there's problems in glucose transporters, at least there's some reports to say that. Therefore, the prime fuel is being deprived. There's also an interesting connection from the National Cancer Institute questioning the why people with Alzheimer's disease, their risk for cancer is less. And it's kind of an interesting, what they call the provocative question. And it's known that Alzheimer's, you have a starvation of glucose, a hypometabolic state. And whereas cancer is just the opposite. You need a lot of glucose to drive the disease. So if your body is hypometabolic, it's going to be unlikely, not completely. There's people, just in general, it's going to be less likely you'll develop a tumor that requires a high energy of glucose, and you can't develop that. Your brain is dying, but your tumor would not be able to grow also. So you have this, in one say the neurons are starving of glucose, but you can't develop cancer. Excuse me. On the other hand, tumor cells need glucose and they can't grow too well. So it's a very interesting, all of these diseases in some way or another are linked to disruptions in systemic energy metabolism. So in one case, it might be one molecule, in another case, it might be another molecule. So the brain is flexible. It can burn glucose and ketones, and the liver, of course, goes quite active when blood sugar goes down, because the liver can make glucose from within. And that will provide the brain. Most of that glucose is going to the brain. The rest of it is provided by ketones. And this prevents us from going unconscious. So when blood sugars become reduced, now if you take someone who is not in therapeutic ketosis and give them insulin, it clears the sugar right out of their blood and they become unconscious. This is an insulin surge. Some of these people with diabetes have these kinds of reactions. But if a person is in therapeutic ketosis and then gets the insulin, oftentimes, at least we've done it in the animals, in the mice, they don't go unconscious because their brain is actually burning an alternative fuel. So even if you take away all the glucose, that brain is still functional because it's burning ketones. So you have a very different physiological response.
Okay.
And nutritional ketosis are the same thing, or very similar. This is a very different situation than ketoacidosis,
right,
which is very, very unphysiologically high levels of ketones, usually associated with type 1 diabetes, where you have both high blood sugar and high ketones together in the blood. This is a very dangerous metabolic situation, very different from therapeutic ketosis, where the body is gaining a health advantage by burning ketones. To date, because we had been working with ketogenic diets in epilepsy, which is the area where most of this research has been done, and that goes back to the 1920s, when people were finding that to stop epileptic seizures, the people would stop eating for several days, the seizures would disappear. But this is not a long-term therapeutic situation. So what happens when people stop eating? Blood sugar goes down and ketones go up. And some of the physicians of the day try to replicate this physiological state through a dietary intervention, which would allow blood sugars to remain low and steady and ketones to be elevated, using a dietary approach rather than fasting, which brings us to starvation, and you can't be healthy when you're starving. So these diets were designed to replicate the physiological state of fasting. It's well known that therapeutic fasting, that's the inanition, stopping of eating food for several days to weeks, is generally is a state of great health. Again, you don't do this for extended periods of time because then you enter into the realm of starvation, which is a very pathological state, as you know. Before you hit the starvation threshold, fasting and therapeutic ketosis can be very healthy. People might think, if I were to have cancer, certainly I would do these things. 18-hour fasts, which are really, very minor in state. I do that quite often, but 3-day fasts, I did that once. It's not easy. The older you get, the harder it is. You, young guy like you should be able to handle that no problem. My students can handle it. But you get guys in their 60s and 70s, and you tell them, okay, let's stop eating for 3 to 5 days. And they say, you do it and tell me what it's like. The issue, of course, is your brain over years becomes set in certain ways, and glucose addiction is a very powerful addiction. It's every bit as strong as it can be. For some people, every bit as strong as a cocaine or alcohol addiction. It's hard for the brain in other words, when you start lowering blood sugar, the body physiological changes go through a withdrawal physiology that's every bit as similar to a nicotine withdrawal or an alcohol or drug withdrawal. Mm. Of course, is that the body evolved over millions, our bodies have evolved over millions of years to exist in a semi-starved state. So, we're really not, we just have to break that barrier to the glucose addiction. And then we enter back into the physiological condition that we really evolved in, which has always been a semi-starved state, because food was only available when you could catch it. have it in the environment at a particular season. It wasn't always a constant high level of high carbohydrate, high energy foods. And now we find ourselves in a very different environment, leading to a whole range of chronic illnesses that result from this new, what we call a new food environment. Exactly what it is. Yeah, and I think that's the issue that needs to be addressed and understood by people. Not only the lay public. The lay public seems to understand this better than do the professional scientists. That cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease. Why? Indoctrination that most of these folks have been subjected to over the years. It's quite recognized that cancer is a genetic disease in all the textbooks, and most of the scientific research done and sponsored by the National Cancer Institute, the National Institutes of Health, is based on the hypothesis that cancer is a genetic disease. So if you have been a person who has received significant money over decades of research looking for gene mutations in cancer and all these other kinds of things, that's kind of an addiction also, and it needs to be broken because that line of research and that emphasis has amounted to very little progress in our management of the disease. And it stems, the little progress that we have made in cancer over the last 50 years has been due in large part to the false or the misunderstanding of what the nature of the disease actually is. Once we understand that this is a mitochondrial metabolic disease, then the kinds of therapies and approaches become totally different. Diseases can be managed non-toxically, very cost-effectively, non-toxic therapies that we now see are beginning to work, and this will change the entire perspective of what this disease actually is. We broke down the origin of the disease to show how all of the risk factors, whether environmental or genetic, target the mitochondria. So, and that means the genetic risk factors are secondary, not primary. Okay. If you're exposed to various what we call carcinogens damage the respiration in certain cells, populations of cells in tissues and organs, putting them on the path to forming a tumor. So people know we avoid carcinogens. Carcinogens are cancer-producing agents. How do they produce cancer? They damage the respiration in the mitochondria of the cells, forcing the cell into a fermentation metabolism, which then produces reactive oxygen species, which then produce the mutations that people find in these tumor cells. So the mutations themselves, what we call somatic mutations, not mutations that you inherit in your genome, but somatic mutations, are produced as downstream products, epiphenomena of the damage to the respiration. So viruses can produce cancer, and people say, how does that happen? Viruses damage the respiration in the cells, the mitochondria, thereby forcing the cells into a fermentation metabolism, thereby producing a whole array of different mutations. Inflammation can damage the same thing. So then you have your inherited mutations, like BRCA1, BRCA2, the Li-Fraumeni. There's a variety of so-called inherited genes that predispose you to cancer. These genes also damage the mitochondria and respiration, producing then a plethora of other kinds of somatic mutations. So we then view the inherited conditions as secondary, not primary. And the reason for that is some people inherit BRCA1 and they never develop cancer. They have the gene, but the gene does not, in those people, damage the respiration. Therefore, they do not get cancer. Same with the Li-Fraumeni. This is called penetrance. It's like what is the probability that I'll manifest the disease based on the fact that I carry the gene? So then if you look at the whole population, you find that the BRCA1 is about 40 to 50% penetrant, which means that 50% of the people who have the gene develop the disease, and 50% of the people who have the gene don't develop the disease. So what's going on with these? But only the people that develop the disease where the gene damages the respiration. The other folks, and for one reason or another, mitochondria were protected and were not. So this then puts the whole cancer perspective into the idea that it's a mitochondrial metabolic disease. So once you realize that, then the strategies, it's a very simple disease once you realize that. And the other thing is that all these cancers are the same, whether it's a brain cancer, a breast cancer, a colon cancer, bladder cancer, they all have the same metabolic problem, very similar metabolic problem. They ferment. So if these are fermenting cells in different cancers, then what does that mean? That, well, the fermentation metabolism requires only fuels that can produce energy without oxygen. So what are these fuels, and what are the major fuels that are driving the disease? It's glucose and glutamine. So what happens to the cancer when you take away the fermentable fuels? They die. So the same strategy can be used to treat and manage the variety of cancers. And today we have 1,600 people a day in this country dying from cancer. It's a silent epidemic that no one's talking about, that has a very clear metabolic solution that very few people either understand or are willing to address. Anything about this? You don't hear every night on the news. If we had 1,600 people a day dying from some other condition,
right,
we all lose. Are you kidding me?
Right.
You're asking the normal cells of the body, which also use glucose, to upregulate transporters to get more glucose in there. So they're now they're now directly competing with the tumor cell. If the glucose is abundant in the bloodstream, then there's no competition. The tumor cell will be able to suck in as much glucose as possible, the tumor cells, and the normal cells will not put any pressure because they don't need very much glucose. They're so energy efficient. When tumor cells are fermenters, so a fermenting cell is a very metabolically inefficient cell. So the raw material to drive that cell must be present in abundance, whereas the normal cells are much more energy efficient in that light. But essentially, it's very similar. It's a similar physiological situation. When the body is in a energetically stressed situation, the efficiency of every cell in the body must be at its maximum. Tumor cells are clearly not in that group. They're fermenters. They're not using energy efficiently. As a matter of fact, autophagy, which is self-eating, self-digestion, increases during calorie restriction in these energy-efficient states. So inefficient organelles within cells are digested for the good of the cell, or inefficient cells are digested for the good of the whole. Mm-hmm. What we are ending up with then is a body that's supremely qualified to generate energy at maximal efficiency. If we have a surfeit of energy, these monitoring processes are rarely engaged. So cells that are inefficient are more or less not surveilled, not eliminated, and they persist, which then would lead to risk of developing a tumor dependent on fermentation metabolism. It would keep us in a high state of physiological health, a higher state. Let's put it that way. Right. Ketones, in order to metabolize, ketones are beautiful fuel. They generate very few oxygen free radicals compared to the metabolism of glucose. It's a very sophisticated bioenergetic process. So our bodies, our cells can all, most of our cells, not everyone, but can switch from metabolizing glucose for energy to metabolizing ketone bodies for energy. And the liver, of course, uses fatty acids for energy because they make ketones. They don't use ketones. But basically, we transition our whole body over to an alternative fuel, and that requires good, healthy, functional mitochondria. So tumor cells have various degrees of abnormality in their mitochondria, in their ability to generate energy through oxygen, oxidative phosphorylation. So that part of the mitochondria seems to be defective. And that's why these tumor cells must use fermentation, either in the cytoplasm or in the mitochondria. The mitochondria can ferment amino acids, and glutamine is a primary amino acid. So that then defines what the nature of the tumor is. It's a fermenting machine that uses fermentable products. And ketone is not a fermentable product. Therefore, ketone cannot be used effectively by tumor cells. So if you flood the body with ketones and take away fermentable fuels, you're actually helping the normal cells get stronger and putting a great amount of metabolic pressure on the tumor cells. Is that the metastatic cell, the cell that actually metastasizes, is a fundamentally different kind of a cell than other tumor cells. So yes, calorie restriction, fasting, and restricted ketogenic diets stop blood vessels, which can support the growth of a tumor. However, the metastatic cell it's evolved to live in hypoxic environments. This is why anti-angiogenic therapies will be largely ineffective. In fact, are in stopping metastatic cancer. Stop metastatic cancer. These cells, the metastatic cell is derived from our immune system. It's a corrupted macrophage or leukocyte or one of these kinds of cells, and they thrive on glutamine. So you could remove all the glucose and you could remove all the blood vessels, and these metastatic cells will still be surviving. Once you take away their fermentable amino acid glutamine and glucose, you got to shut the front door and the back door. Mm-hmm. Only then when you start to kill off the majority of metastatic cells. So I published a paper recently with my physician colleagues and Don D'Agostino on the press pulse concept, which is a strategy, a cocktail of drugs and diets and procedures that are designed to eliminate glucose and glutamine strategically. And you need drugs. It's, if you want to resolve cancer, it's very hard to do it with diet alone. The diet becomes an extremely important component of the cocktail. So we use the diet as a chronic stress on the tumor cells in the mechanisms that I just mentioned. And then we introduce hyperbaric oxygen, hyperthermia, insulin potentiation, glutamine targeting drugs, all of which will work synergistically together to degrade the tumor while enhancing the health and vitality of the normal cells. A totally different approach to managing cancer than what we have today in the majority of medical schools, which are almost clueless as to the nature of the disease. Right. So our strategy, I think, we're pretty sure will be the future of how we're going to resolve cancer. They put the body at risk for inflammation and other you're damaging respiration. You put your normal cells at risk. Right. Chemotherapies are toxic drugs. These drugs are designed to stop proliferation of the cells because it's assumed that mutations lead to dysregulated cell growth. So we're going to use toxic chemicals to break DNA and try to stop. All you have to do is take away the fermentable fuels and you get the same result without the toxicity. Right. Hyperbaric oxygen, we think, kills the tumor cells in a similar way does radiation. Hyperbaric oxygen is a much less toxic approach. So why? So I don't want to get into the obscenity as to why we use these toxic drugs and radiation, because it is an obscenity. And we're trying to keep people alive and healthy. Right. Glutamine is the most abundant amino acid in the body, and it cannot be effectively managed, in my mind, at least at this point, by diet alone. Diets, because our muscles contain glutamine. Cancer breaks down our muscles. The tumor will get glutamine. It's an effective way to fuel the tumor. Fermentable systems require an abundance, a much greater abundance of fuel than does a respiratory system. Mm-hmm. The respiratory systems are remarkably efficient, and they can use the minimal amounts of metabolizable fuels. The tumor cell is an ineffective system. So it will use glucose and amino acid fermentation to drive its growth. So the idea then is you have to interfere with these procedures, and also the tumor cells will phagocytate, engulf, and digest inside the tumor cell itself. So you need drugs that will interfere with each one of these steps. But these drugs must be delivered, scheduled, time, and dosed so as not to harm the patient. the key thing here is you want to manage the disease without causing any adverse toxicity to the body. Mm-hmm. So seeing cancer patients with bald heads is a clear sign that those individuals are being treated by people who have very little knowledge about the nature of the disease. So every time you see a bald-headed person, you know that person is being mistreated by someone who really doesn't understand the nature of cancer. I think the best way to do that is therapeutic fasting. People always say, can't you find an easier way? Does it have to be so draconian? You know, it's like, oh man, isn't there another way? Well, there is. I mean, you eat certain diets that are going to be healthy for the body overall and mitochondria. But the best way to get mitochondria healthy is to burn ketones. So you have to do that strategically. You have to lower the blood sugar and you have to elevate the blood ketones. And, you know, we published this glucose ketone index calculator in open access. And I think the app Heads Up Health is using it for general well-being and health for people. It's a simple device. It just calculates the millimoles of glucose and the ratio of glucose to ketones. And if the lower the number, it's like a golf score. The lower the number, the better you are. So, you know, this is a tool that allows normal, healthy people without disease to know whether or not they're in a metabolic zone that's maximally efficient for keeping their mitochondria healthy. Well, you know, since we started all this, we're finding that the lay public are coming up with some innovative ways to enhance this. It's amazing. So once you define the parameters that you need to be in, then people find ways to get into those zones that may not be as difficult as what we all thought might have been. So I've spoken to some folks who like to go on a somewhat slightly restricted ketogenic diet, lowering their blood sugar and elevating their ketones, and then going on a water-only fast. And they say the transition now becomes so much less difficult when making those kinds of transitions, as opposed to, okay, let's just cut out all food and just drink, you know, water or green tea or something like this. This is hard. I tell you, after the second day, I mean, it's not easy. Believe me, you're ready to really get the body into the zone of surveillance where we're eliminating ineffective cells. I mean, you're talking about 5 to 7 days, okay. 10 days. You know, you try not stop eating for 10 days. The problem, of course, is that I haven't done this, but those guys who do it, you know, the first 5 or 6 days is very, very hard. I mean, people think they're going to die. I mean, that's how bad it is. So stay in the metabolic zone for at least several days. And I think that zone is dictated by your glucose ketone index. Okay. You know, and people have taken ketone supplements along with therapeutic fasting. My colleague, Don D'Agostino from University of South Florida, he's been showing people how you can really bring those the GKI down to really low levels. Blood sugars in the 25 to 30 milligram per deciliter. You know, most physicians would say you should be dead because we're burning the ketones. So how long can you stay in these metabolic zones? How in this? But you have you know, there are guys on the web. If you go out and look at GKI guys, they've been doing a fasting for 10 days using our GKI to maintain their zone of metabolic efficiency. But you don't want people to go overboard with this stuff. You know, you'd be surprised how many of these people become fanatics at this. Oh, I can do it longer than you. I can get a lower blood sugar than you, and, you know, higher ketones than you. I mean, it's going on here. Right. Challenge, right? You know, but, you know, notwithstanding, I think for the majority of people in the population that just would like to know that there is something that they themselves can take charge of and do to maybe once a year or whatever, it makes them feel good. You know, it just says it's tough to do, but I did it, and I think I feel a lot better. Right. And that's, I think, the ultimate goal of this. You know, this is an important problem, probably the singular most important problem. It's a tragedy. You know, we know what to do. We have some physicians who can do it. The problem is the system, the way it's set up now, prevents us from doing this. In other words, using drugs and diets and procedures in a cocktail therapy not involving radiation and chemo is just not acceptable to treat somebody with cancer like this. So, and that's why some of these really important and evidence medicine is coming from outside the United States, in Turkey, because they're achieving remarkable success in applying this metabolic approach, this press pulse strategy for cancer patients, with remarkable success for a broad range of stage 4 cancers. Now, what we do in this country is, well, we might consider a metabolic approach only after you've had the standard of care. And for brain cancer, that's devastating. I mean, you're getting irradiated and poisoned, expecting to get healthy after something like this. This is not in the what's going to happen. So you need to take these metabolic therapies and you need to do them first. And we're seeing when people do that without the toxicity, the responses are remarkably better. Now, this is going to be a very hard pill to swallow for the strategies in this country, that we can manage this disease without these toxic treatments. And of course, the argument is from the establishment is, well, where are the clinical trials to document this? And the question is, you'd have to change the structure of the standards of care to allow these kinds of studies to be done. And they're based on such fundamentally hard scientific evidence, it becomes difficult to deny that this would work. And so they said, well, we don't see the clinical trial. First of all, who's going to do the trial? The technology. Right. Only it could be the singular greatest disruptive technology in the history of medicine. Right. Convince John Wiley Press of that. Okay. So far, I have not been able to get even 3 books for myself, because they're translating the book into Chinese and I think some other languages as well. We're doing a lot of YouTube videos. There'll be a movie out on the cancer series in dogs. Actually, I didn't mention anything about the dog stuff, but the dogs are responding remarkably well to metabolic therapies. Wow. Cancer in dogs is just as much of an epidemic as it is in humans, and the dogs are doing remarkably. That's the thing. All the cancers are the same. Yeah. We're giving them raw meat diets, keto diets, and hyperbaric oxygen. We're doing the same thing basically. Wow. With some drugs, and this is another indication that all these cancers are the same. So when you have people running for breast cancer, colon, brain, it's all the same disease. People have to understand these are not. Cancer is not, you hear this on the news, cancer is 1,000 diseases. No, it's not. It's a singular disease of energy metabolism. All these cancers respond to the same therapy. And this is like, what? How can you explain this? Because if you understand the basic biochemical problem in the tumor cell, all this becomes completely explainable. It's not that complicated. People make it out to be such a complicated disease. You know, we're cutting out livers and cutting out colons. You don't need to be doing all that stuff. You know, it's just, you can shrink those tumors down. I mean, half the surgeries we don't need, the chemicals we don't need. I mean, this is just, when you start to look into it, it's going to be unbelievable. Yeah. So dogs, yes, the dogs. So there's a big movie coming out. It's called Dog Cancer Series. I think Joe Mercola has a movie or series of movies on diet and disease. So there's a number of different mediums that are starting to show this work, and the lay people are getting more and more educated about this. They need to know about this. So I think the change will come probably from a grassroots, very unlikely to come from the top medical schools. They have too much to lose as the result of this.